Have you ever wondered what happens when someone thinks they're above the law meets someone whose job it is to uphold tradition and order? What occurs when modern entitlement crashes headfirst into centuries-old duty and discipline? This is the story of Karen Mitchell, a woman who believed her credit card and loud voice could open any door, and Officer James Sterling, a member of the Queen's Guard whose unwavering commitment to his post would teach her the most expensive lesson of her life. In a world where viral videos can destroy reputations in minutes, and where respect seems to be a forgotten concept, this true story will show you exactly what happens when someone pushes too far against someone who simply cannot and will not be moved. You're about to witness a collision between two very different worlds, one where everything has a price and another where duty is priceless. The aftermath will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about consequences, respect, and the power of standing your ground. This isn't just another Karen story. This is about what happens when unstoppable force meets an immovable object, and the shocking lesson that followed will stay with you long after you finish reading. The morning sun cast long shadows across the ancient stones of Windsor Castle as Karen Mitchell stepped out of her luxury rental car, her designer heels clicking against the cobblestones with the confidence of someone who had never been told no. At 42, Karen had built her life around the simple principle that money could solve any problem and that her voice, when raised to the proper volume, could move any mountain. She adjusted her Chanel sunglasses and smoothed down her perfectly pressed blazer, checking her reflection in the car window one final time. Today was supposed to be perfect. She had planned this trip to England for months, meticulously organizing every detail of what she called her royal experience vacation. The itinerary was packed with exclusive tours, private viewings, and what she believed would be unprecedented access to places most tourists could only dream of entering. Karen had spent over $15,000 on this trip, and she expected every penny's worth of special treatment. In her mind, that payment entitled her to bypass the usual rules and restrictions that applied to ordinary people. After all, she reasoned, she wasn't just any tourist. She was Karen Mitchell, owner of 3 successful nail salons in suburban Phoenix, holder of a platinum credit card, and someone who had never encountered a problem that couldn't be solved with the right combination of money and determination. The castle grounds were already bustling with early morning tourists, their cameras flashing as they captured photos of the magnificent architecture. Karen barely glanced at them. She had bigger plans than taking pictures from behind velvet ropes like some common sightseer. She had researched extensively and discovered that the Queen's Guard performed their ceremonial duties at specific locations around the castle. More importantly, she had learned that their famous stoic demeanor made them popular subjects for tourist photos. But Karen wanted more than just a photo. She wanted the ultimate social media moment, something that would make all her friends back home green with envy. She had already planned the perfect Instagram post in her head, complete with captions about her exclusive royal encounter and VIP castle experience. Officer James Sterling had been a member of the Queen's Guard for 8 years, and in that time, he had seen every type of tourist behavior imaginable. He stood at his post near the castle's main courtyard, his red tunic immaculate, his black bearskin hat perfectly positioned, and his expression as unmovable as the stone walls that surrounded him. At 29, James had dedicated his life to serving the crown, and he took his duties more seriously than most people took their religion. The Queen's Guard weren't just ceremonial figures in fancy uniforms. They were active serving soldiers trained in combat and crowd control, responsible for protecting one of the most important buildings in the British monarchy. James understood that tourists often misunderstood their role, seeing them as living statues rather than professional military personnel. He had learned to ignore the constant stream of people trying to make him laugh, taking selfies, and occasionally attempting to touch his uniform or weapon. James had grown up in a military family in Yorkshire. His father had served in the Royal Navy, and his grandfather had been a decorated veteran of World War II. From childhood, James had understood the concepts of duty, honor, and service. Joining the Queen's Guard wasn't just a job for him. It was the culmination of everything he had been taught about serving something greater than himself. Standing guard required intense mental discipline. James could remain motionless for hours, maintaining perfect posture while processing everything happening around him. He was trained to identify potential threats, manage crowd situations, and respond appropriately to any disturbance. Most importantly, he understood that his presence represented centuries of British military tradition and the dignity of the monarchy itself. Karen approached the courtyard with the swagger of someone accustomed to getting their way. She had already spent the morning arguing with tour guides about accessing restricted areas, complaining to hotel staff about the size of her supposedly luxury room, and demanding upgrades that weren't available. Each interaction had left her more frustrated and more determined to assert her authority. She spotted James standing guard and immediately saw her opportunity. Here was the perfect backdrop for her social media moment. But as she got closer, observing his rigid posture and unwavering stare, an idea began forming in her mind. Why settle for just standing next to him when she could create something truly memorable? Karen had heard stories about the Queen's Guard being required to remain motionless no matter what happened around them. She had seen viral videos of tourists trying various antics to get reactions from the guards, usually without success. But Karen was convinced she could succeed where others had failed. After all, she had never met a person who couldn't be influenced with the right approach. She began by simply standing near James, taking several selfies, and making loud comments about how adorable he looked in his uniform. When he showed no reaction, she moved closer, commenting on various aspects of his appearance, as if he were a museum exhibit rather than a human being. "Look at this little soldier boy," she announced loudly to nobody in particular, her voice carrying across the courtyard. "So serious with his big fuzzy hat. I bet he's dying to smile, but just can't because of all those stuffy royal rules." Other tourists began gathering around, initially amused by Karen's commentary, but gradually becoming uncomfortable as her behavior escalated. James remained perfectly still, his eyes focused straight ahead, but internally he was already assessing the situation. He had dealt with difficult tourists before, but something about this woman's demeanor suggested she wasn't going to be satisfied with simple photos and comments. Karen interpreted his lack of response as a challenge rather than professionalism. In her world, silence meant weakness, and weakness meant opportunity. She had built her business empire by pushing boundaries and refusing to take no for an answer. She saw no reason why this situation should be any different. She moved even closer to James, now standing directly in front of him and waving her hands near his face. "Hello in there," she called out in a sing-song voice. "Anybody home? Can you even see me through all that hair on your hat?" A small crowd had gathered, phones out, capturing what they assumed would be another harmless tourist interaction. Some laughed nervously at Karen's antics, while others exchanged concerned glances. A few British tourists in the group began to look genuinely upset, understanding better than the international visitors that what they were witnessing crossed lines of respect and decorum. James maintained his position, but his training allowed him to monitor the crowd's reaction while staying focused on the woman in front of him. He could sense the situation was escalating and began mentally preparing for the protocols he might need to implement if her behavior continued to deteriorate. Karen's frustration was mounting. She was accustomed to immediate responses to her demands, and James's continued silence felt like a personal insult. She had paid good money for this vacation, and she was going to get the experience she wanted, regardless of whatever silly rules might be in place. "I'm talking to you," she said, her voice rising with irritation. "The least you could do is acknowledge me. I'm a paying customer here, and I deserve some basic courtesy." The irony of demanding courtesy while showing none herself was lost on Karen. She had become so accustomed to treating service workers as extensions of her will that she couldn't recognize the fundamental difference between a retail employee and a soldier on duty. To her, James was just another person whose job it was to make her happy. She reached into her designer purse and pulled out her phone, switching it to video mode. If she couldn't get him to react normally, she would try to provoke a reaction she could capture and share. The idea of going viral with a video of her breaking a Queen's Guard was too appealing to resist. "Let's see how long you can keep this up," she announced, holding her phone up and beginning to record. "I'm going to stay right here until you admit that this whole silent soldier thing is just an act." James could see the phone in his peripheral vision, but it didn't change his approach. He had been recorded countless times before, and he understood that maintaining his professionalism was even more important when cameras were involved. Any reaction he gave would be preserved forever and could reflect poorly on the regiment, the monarchy, and everything he had sworn to protect. Karen began a running commentary for her video, describing her experiment in breaking down what she called the ridiculous royal robot. She seemed to believe that her behavior was clever and entertaining, completely oblivious to how it appeared to the growing crowd of onlookers. "I want to try to get a reaction from the Queen's toy soldier," she narrated in her phone. "So far, he's pretending to be a statue, but I've got all day and plenty of ideas." Some tourists began to drift away, uncomfortable with the spectacle, while others stayed to see how far Karen would go. A few British visitors started making comments about ugly Americans and disrespectful tourists, but Karen either didn't hear them or chose to ignore their disapproval. She began trying different tactics, making faces at James, telling loud jokes, and even starting to sing off-key songs she claimed were traditional British ballads. Each failed attempt to get a response only fueled her determination to escalate further. "Maybe you're hard of hearing under all that fur," she said, moving closer and speaking louder. "Or maybe you're just not very bright. I bet if I spoke slowly and used simple words, you'd understand better." The condescending tone and increasing volume of her voice was starting to attract attention from more than just tourists. Castle security personnel began taking note of the situation, though they initially held back to see if the guard could handle it himself according to standard protocols. Karen noticed their attention and misinterpreted it as validation of her entertainment value. She was convinced she was putting on a show that everyone was enjoying, when in reality, she was creating a disturbance that was making most people deeply uncomfortable. "Look at all these people watching," she announced to her phone camera. "Everyone wants to see if I can crack the code and get Soldier Boy here to break character." James remained motionless, but his awareness of the situation was complete. He could sense the crowd's mood, monitor Karen's behavior, and track the positions of security personnel without moving his eyes. His training had prepared him for exactly this type of scenario, though the duration and persistence of this particular tourist behavior was testing even his considerable patience. Karen decided it was time to escalate to physical contact. She had convinced herself that touching his uniform or equipment would finally force some kind of reaction. In her mind, she was still just having harmless fun, pushing boundaries like she had her entire life without ever facing serious consequences. She reached toward James's uniform, intending to straighten his tie or adjust something on his jacket. To her, it seemed like a playful gesture, no different from posing with a wax figure at a museum. She had no understanding of the protocols surrounding the Queen's Guard or the significance of maintaining their dignity and the integrity of their post. The moment her finger made contact with James's red tunic, everything changed. His training kicked in immediately, and he shifted from passive observation to active response mode. The Queen's Guard were authorized to act when their person or equipment was threatened, and unwanted physical contact fell clearly within that category. "Ma'am, step back immediately," James said, his voice carrying the authority of 8 years of military training and centuries of royal tradition. It was the first time he had spoken, and the power in his words cut through Karen's chatter like a blade through silk. Karen was so surprised to finally get a reaction that she initially missed the warning tone entirely. Instead, she was thrilled that her persistence had finally paid off. "Oh, so you can talk," she said with satisfaction, completely misreading the situation. "I knew you were just pretending. What else can you do? Can you dance? Can you sing?" James maintained his position, but kept his eyes focused on Karen with new intensity. Ma'am, you need to step back and maintain appropriate distance. This is your only warning. The word warning should have penetrated Karen's excitement, but she was too caught up in what she believed was her victory to process the seriousness of the moment. She had gotten the guard to break his silence, and now she wanted to see what other rules she could get him to bend. Warning about what? She laughed, still recording with her phone. What are you going to do? Arrest me for touching your pretty red shirt. I'm just having a little fun here. Several tourists in the crowd began backing away, sensing that the situation was about to shift dramatically. The British visitors particularly seemed to understand that Karen had crossed from amusing annoyance into genuinely problematic behavior. James could see security personnel moving closer, ready to intervene if necessary, but he also knew that this was still his situation to control. The protocols were clear, and Karen's continued disrespect and physical contact had moved this encounter into territory that required decisive action. Ma'am, I am ordering you to step back and cease this behavior immediately, he said, his voice carrying unmistakable authority. You are interfering with official duties and showing disrespect to the Crown. Karen finally began to sense that something had changed, but her years of bulldozing through opposition with sheer persistence made it impossible for her to recognize when she should retreat. Instead of stepping back, she doubled down on her approach. Official duties? She scoffed. You're just standing there looking pretty for tourists. I'm a paying customer, and if I want to touch your costume, that's my right. I paid for this experience. The word costume hit James like a physical blow. She had just reduced 8 years of military service, centuries of tradition, and everything he held sacred to a mere costume for tourist entertainment. At that moment, he realized that Karen Mitchell was about to learn a lesson about respect that would stay with her for the rest of her life. The tension in the courtyard was thick enough to cut with a knife as James Sterling processed what Karen Mitchell had just said. The word costume echoed in his mind, representing everything that was wrong with her understanding of his role and purpose. This wasn't just disrespect anymore. This was a fundamental assault on the dignity of an institution that had served the Crown for centuries. Karen stood there with her phone still recording, completely oblivious to the gravity of what she had just unleashed. She was still operating under the delusion that this was all entertainment, that James was essentially a performer whose job was to amuse tourists like herself. She had no concept of the line she had just crossed or the consequences that were about to follow. Did everyone hear that? She announced to her phone camera, turning slightly to include the crowd in her video. He thinks he's too important to be touched. These royal guards take themselves so seriously, like they're actual soldiers instead of just tourist attractions. The crowd's reaction was immediate and telling. Several British tourists audibly gasped, while others began shaking their heads in disbelief. International visitors might not have understood all the cultural implications, but even they could sense that something significant had just happened. The atmosphere had shifted from uncomfortable amusement to genuine concern about what was about to unfold. James had reached his breaking point, but his response was going to be measured, professional, and devastating. He had spent 8 years learning not just how to stand guard, but how to de-escalate situations, manage crowds, and, when necessary, take decisive action to protect the integrity of his post and the institution he represented. Ma'am, he said, his voice now carrying a tone that made several tourists take involuntary steps backward. You are now interfering with military personnel in the execution of their duties. You have been given multiple opportunities to correct your behavior and maintain appropriate respect. You have chosen to ignore those opportunities. Karen finally began to sense that she might have misjudged the situation, but her years of getting her way through persistence and entitlement made it impossible for her to back down. Instead of apologizing or stepping away, she chose to escalate further. Military personnel, she laughed, but there was a nervous edge to it now. You're not military. You're just a guy in a funny hat who stand around for pictures. Don't try to intimidate me with your fake authority. I know my rights as a tourist." James remained motionless, but his response was swift and decisive. With a subtle hand signal that Karen didn't even notice, he alerted nearby security personnel that the situation required immediate intervention. The signal was part of a well-rehearsed protocol designed to handle exactly this type of escalating incident. Within seconds, 3 castle security officers began moving toward Karen from different directions, their approach coordinated and professional. They moved with the quiet efficiency of people who had handled similar situations many times before, though few tourists had ever pushed things quite as far as Karen had. "Ma'am," the lead security officer said as he approached, "we need you to stop recording and step away from the guard immediately." Karen whirled around to face the new voice, her phone still in her hand, still recording. She was beginning to realize that this situation was spiraling beyond her control, but her instinct was to fight rather than retreat. "Are you kidding me?" she demanded, her voice rising to a level that was now carrying across the entire courtyard. "I'm being harassed by costume performers and rent-a-cops because I wanted to take some pictures. This is ridiculous. I want to speak to someone in charge right now." The security officer maintained his professional demeanor, but his tone left no room for negotiation. "Ma'am, you are currently interfering with official duties and creating a disturbance on royal property. We need you to comply with our instructions immediately." Karen looked around the courtyard, finally beginning to register the dozens of eyes watching her, the phones recording her behavior, and the obvious disapproval on most of the faces surrounding her. For the first time since she had started this confrontation, doubt began creeping into her mind. But instead of using this moment of clarity to de-escalate the situation, Karen made the decision that would transform her from a difficult tourist into a viral sensation for all the wrong reasons. She decided that her best defense was to go on the offensive and claim that she was the victim of harassment and discrimination. "This is unacceptable," she announced loudly, making sure her phone was capturing everything. "I'm an American citizen being harassed by foreign security forces because I wanted to interact with what I thought were public performers. This is discrimination against tourists, and I'm going to make sure everyone knows about it." James continued to maintain his post, but he was now monitoring every word Karen said, every movement she made. His training had taught him that situations like this could escalate rapidly, and he needed to be prepared for any outcome. The presence of the security officers meant he could maintain his ceremonial duties while they handled the immediate problem, but he remained ready to act if the situation required his direct intervention. The lead security officer stepped closer to Karen, his body language making it clear that this was no longer a request. "Ma'am, you need to understand that the Queen's Guard are active military personnel performing official duties. Interfering with them is a serious offense. We're asking you one final time to step away and cease this behavior." Karen's response was to raise her phone higher, making sure she was capturing everything for what she believed would be a viral video that would vindicate her behavior and expose what she saw as abuse of authority. "Are you threatening me?" she demanded. "Because I'm recording everything, and the whole world is going to see how tourists are treated here. You can't intimidate me just because I wanted to have some fun with your little dress-up soldier." The phrase dress-up soldier was the final straw. James had endured insults to himself and his uniform, but this direct mockery of military service crossed a line that could not be uncrossed. He gave another subtle signal, this one indicating that he was authorizing the security team to take whatever action was necessary to resolve the situation. The security officers moved with practiced efficiency. The lead officer stepped directly in front of Karen while his colleagues positioned themselves on either side of her, creating a controlled space that isolated her from both James and the crowd of onlookers. "Ma'am," the lead officer said with finality, "you are being removed from the premises for disruptive behavior and interference with official duties. You need to come with us immediately." Karen's eyes widened as she finally realized that this was no longer a game she could win through persistence and volume. The security officers weren't hotel employees or tour guides she could intimidate with complaints and demands from managers. They were professionals with actual authority who were no longer asking for her cooperation. "You can't remove me," she protested, but her voice had lost much of its earlier confidence. "I paid for tours here. I have rights. I demand to speak to someone in charge of this place right now." The security officer closest to her reached out and firmly but professionally took hold of her arm. "Ma'am, you're leaving the premises now. You can walk with us cooperatively, or we can arrange alternative transportation." Karen tried to pull away from his grip, but quickly discovered that these weren't ordinary security guards. They were trained professionals who knew exactly how to control a situation without using excessive force. Her struggles only made it more obvious to the watching crowd that she was completely out of her depth. "This is assault," she cried out, her voice now carrying a note of desperation. "You're assaulting an American tourist. I'm going to have all of you arrested. I'm going to sue this entire place." The crowd watched in fascination as Karen was escorted away from James's post, her threats and protests echoing across the courtyard. Many tourists continued recording, ensuring that her behavior would be preserved and shared far beyond the castle grounds. James remained at his post throughout the entire escort process, maintaining his professional demeanor even as Karen continued to shout insults and threats over her shoulder. His training had prepared him for situations exactly like this, and he knew that his calm professionalism during the crisis would be just as important as his actions during the confrontation. As Karen was led away, several tourists approached other guards and security personnel to express their disgust with her behavior and their appreciation for how professionally the situation had been handled. Many commented that they were embarrassed to share nationality with someone who would show such disrespect in a place of historical and cultural significance. But Karen's ordeal was far from over. As she was escorted through the castle grounds toward the exit, she continued to record with her phone and provide running commentary about what she characterized as her unjust treatment. She was convinced that her video would vindicate her and expose what she saw as abuse of authority. "This is what happens when you stand up to bullies in uniforms," she narrated breathlessly as she was walked toward the gate. "They can't handle a strong woman who won't be intimidated by their little power games." The security officers remained silent during her rant, following their protocols for dealing with disruptive individuals. They had seen this type of behavior before, and they knew that engaging with her accusations would only escalate the situation further. As they approached the main gate, Karen saw her opportunity to make one final stand. She had spotted a group of tourists entering the castle grounds, and she decided to appeal to them as witnesses to what she portrayed as her unjust treatment. "Everyone needs to know what's happening here," she called out to the entering tourists, her phone still recording. "They're throwing out paying customers for taking pictures. Don't let them treat you like this." The entering tourists looked confused and uncomfortable as they watched Karen being escorted out while making increasingly frantic claims about her treatment. Most of them stepped aside to avoid getting involved in whatever drama was unfolding. The lead security officer finally spoke again as they reached the gate. "Ma'am, you are being permanently banned from these premises. If you attempt to return, you'll be arrested for trespassing. Do you understand?" Karen's face went pale as the reality of her situation finally began to sink in. She had come to Windsor Castle expecting a luxury experience and exclusive access, and she was leaving with a lifetime ban and a phone full of video evidence of her own terrible behavior. "You can't ban me," she said, but her voice lacked conviction. "I have tour reservations. I have paid for services here. Your tour company will be notified, and any applicable refunds will be processed," the officer replied. "You are no longer welcome on royal property. This is your final warning." As Karen stood outside the castle gates, still holding her phone, she began to realize the magnitude of what had just happened. She was banned from one of England's most important tourist destinations. Her expensive tour was canceled, and she had video evidence of her own behavior that painted her in the worst possible light. But instead of taking this opportunity for self-reflection, Karen made the decision that would transform her from a banned tourist into an international symbol of entitled behavior. She decided to post her videos online, convinced that sharing her story would generate sympathy and support for her position. She spent the next hour sitting in her rental car outside the castle grounds, editing her videos and crafting social media posts that portrayed her as a victim of discrimination and abuse of power. She was convinced that once people saw her footage, they would rally to her cause and demand accountability from the castle security and the Queen's Guard. Karen had no idea that she was about to become one of the internet's most notorious examples of tourist misbehavior, or that her name would become synonymous with entitled, disrespectful conduct. She truly believed that she had been wronged and that sharing her story would vindicate her actions. As she prepared to upload her videos to multiple social media platforms, Karen Mitchell had no clue that she was about to learn the hardest lesson of her life about the power of public opinion and the permanence of digital documentation. Her real education was about to begin, and it would be far more brutal and lasting than anything she had experienced inside the castle walls. Karen Mitchell sat in her rental car outside Windsor Castle, her hands trembling slightly as she uploaded her videos to Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and TikTok. She had spent nearly an hour editing the footage, carefully selecting clips that she believed showed her being treated unfairly while minimizing the parts that revealed her increasingly aggressive behavior toward James and the security personnel. Her first post went live on Facebook with the caption, "Discrimination at Windsor Castle. American tourist banned for taking pictures with Queen's Guard. This is how they treat paying customers. Share to expose this abuse." She was convinced that her friends and followers would rally to her cause, sharing her outrage and helping her story go viral for all the right reasons. Within minutes, the first comments began appearing on her posts, but they weren't what Karen had expected. Instead of sympathy and support, she was getting criticism and mockery from people who could see her behavior clearly despite her edited presentation. "Girl, you were harassing that man at his job," wrote one commenter. "He's not there for your entertainment. This is so embarrassing," added another. "You're the reason people hate American tourists. Did you really just call a British soldier a dress-up performer on video and then post it yourself?" wrote a third. Karen refreshed her social media feeds obsessively, watching in growing horror as the comments multiplied. Instead of the supportive response she had anticipated, she was facing a tsunami of criticism from people who saw her behavior as entitled, disrespectful, and deeply embarrassing. But the real nightmare was just beginning. Other tourists who had witnessed the incident had also been recording, and their unedited versions of events were starting to appear online. These videos showed the full context of Karen's behavior, including all the parts she had tried to edit out of her own posts. A British tourist named Emma Sheffield had captured nearly the entire confrontation from start to finish. Her video showed Karen's escalating harassment of James, her dismissive comments about his uniform and duties, and her increasingly aggressive behavior toward the security officers. Most damaging of all, it clearly captured Karen calling James a costume performer and describing the Queen's Guard as tourist attractions rather than military personnel. Emma's video was posted with the caption, entitled "American Tourist Harasses Queen's Guard, Gets Banned from Windsor Castle," then posts edited videos claiming discrimination. Here's what really happened. Within hours, Emma's unedited footage was being shared thousands of times across multiple platforms, while Karen's edited versions were being used as examples of how people try to manipulate situations through selective editing. The contrast between Karen's narrative and the reality captured by independent witnesses was stark and damaging. The story was picked up by British media outlets, who treated it as an example of disrespectful tourist behavior at one of the country's most important historical sites. The Daily Mail ran a story titled "American Tourists' Shocking Disrespect for Queen's Guard Goes Viral," while The Sun called it "The Royal Meltdown, when entitlement meets tradition." American media also began covering the story, but not in the way Karen had hoped. Instead of portraying her as a victim of discrimination, outlets like CNN and NBC presented it as an example of how not to behave while traveling abroad. Travel bloggers and cultural commentators used her case as a teaching moment about respecting local customs and understanding the difference between tourist attractions and active military personnel. Karen's phone began ringing constantly with calls from journalists, bloggers, and even television producers wanting to interview her about the incident. At first, she was excited about the media attention, convinced that it would give her a platform to tell her side of the story and correct what she saw as misrepresentations of her behavior. Her first television interview was with a local news station in Phoenix, where she appeared via video call from her London hotel room. The interviewer had clearly done their research, and Karen quickly found herself on the defensive as they presented her with the unedited footage from other tourists. "Mrs. Mitchell," the interviewer said, "we have video from other witnesses that shows you repeatedly touching the guard despite his request to stop, calling his uniform a costume, and referring to the Queen's Guard as dress-up soldiers. How do you respond to people who say your behavior was disrespectful?" Karen had prepared for questions about discrimination and unfair treatment, but she wasn't ready to defend the specific words and actions captured on video. She struggled to explain her behavior without admitting that she had been wrong. "I was just trying to have a fun interaction," she said defensively. "I didn't know they were real soldiers. I thought they were performers hired to entertain tourists. No one explained the rules to me." The interviewer pressed further, but the guard did ask you to step back and maintain distance. Other tourists report that he gave you multiple warnings. Why didn't you respect his requests? Karen's face flushed as she tried to maintain her position. He was being unnecessarily rigid and unfriendly. In America, customer service means being accommodating and helpful. I was a paying customer, and I expected to be treated with respect. That interview clip was shared widely online, with many people pointing out that Karen was demanding respect while showing none to others. Her attempt to defend her behavior only made the situation worse, as it demonstrated that she still didn't understand why her actions were problematic. The backlash continued to grow as more details about Karen's behavior emerged. Other tourists who had witnessed the incident began sharing their own accounts, describing how uncomfortable her behavior had made them and how embarrassed they were to be associated with her as fellow Americans. One family from Texas posted a detailed account on their travel blog, describing how Karen's behavior had ruined their castle visit and how her loud, aggressive confrontation had frightened their young children. They wrote about feeling ashamed to be American tourists after witnessing her treatment of the guard and security personnel. Karen's own friends and family began distancing themselves from her as the story spread. Several of her customers at the nail salons she owned in Phoenix canceled their appointments, saying they didn't want to support someone who had embarrassed America abroad. Local business groups asked her to step down from her positions on tourism committees, citing the damage her behavior had done to the image of American travelers. The situation became even worse when British military veterans began responding to the story. Many shared their own experiences serving as Queen's Guards, explaining the rigorous training, the importance of their duties, and the deep respect the position commanded in British culture. Their accounts made it clear just how seriously Karen had misunderstood both the role and the significance of the institution she had mocked. One former Queen's Guard, now a decorated sergeant major, wrote a viral post explaining, "The Queen's Guard aren't performers or tourist attractions. They're active serving soldiers with real weapons, real training, and real responsibilities. When someone calls our uniform a costume or treats our duties as entertainment, they're not just disrespecting individual soldiers. They're disrespecting centuries of military service and sacrifice." These responses from actual military personnel were shared thousands of times, providing context that made Karen's behavior appear even more inappropriate and offensive. The story was no longer just about one tourist's bad behavior. It had become a broader discussion about respect, military service, and cultural understanding. Karen tried to control the damage by posting additional videos and statements, but each attempt only made things worse. She posted a video apology, but it was widely criticized as insincere because she spent most of the time defending her actions and claiming she had been misunderstood. Her follow-up posts showed that she still didn't grasp the fundamental issues with her behavior. "I want to apologize if anyone was offended by my interaction with the guard," she said in one video. "That wasn't my intention. I was just trying to have a fun vacation experience, and I didn't realize that some people would be so sensitive about what I thought was harmless tourist behavior." The phrase, "if anyone was offended," and her characterization of the criticism as people being too sensitive only fueled more backlash. People pointed out that she was apologizing for others being offended rather than for her own inappropriate behavior. The personal cost to Karen was devastating. Her business in Phoenix began suffering as customers canceled services and left negative reviews referencing her behavior in England. Her social media accounts were flooded with criticism from around the world, forcing her to limit comments and eventually make her account private. She received legal notice from her travel insurance company indicating that her claim for the canceled tour expenses would be denied because her removal from the premises was due to her own misconduct. The tour company demanded payment for additional costs related to the disruption her behavior had caused. Karen's reputation in her local community was also severely damaged. Local media covered the story extensively, and she found herself recognized in public places by people who had seen the viral videos. She began avoiding her usual restaurants and social venues because of the embarrassment and negative attention. The professional consequences extended beyond her business. She was asked to resign from her position on the Phoenix Tourism Advisory Board after the mayor's office received numerous complaints about having someone associated with such disrespectful tourist behavior representing the city. Professional organizations she belonged to quietly removed her from membership rosters. 6 months after the incident, Karen gave one final interview to a national news program, this time expressing genuine remorse for her behavior. She had spent months reflecting on what had happened and working with a therapist to understand how her entitled attitude had led to such a devastating situation. "I was completely wrong," she said, her voice breaking slightly. "I disrespected that soldier, his service, and everything he represented. I turned what should have been a beautiful cultural experience into an embarrassment that will follow me for the rest of my life. I thought money and persistence could give me anything I wanted, but I learned that respect can't be demanded or purchased." The interviewer asked what she would say to other travelers who might find themselves in similar situations. Karen's response was heartfelt and hard-earned through painful experience. "Research the places you visit. Understand the culture and customs before you go. Remember that the people working at these sites aren't there for your entertainment. They're professionals doing important jobs. Most importantly, respect is something you give, not something you demand. No amount of money you've spent gives you the right to treat people badly." James Sterling continued his service with the Queen's Guard, becoming something of a folk hero among his colleagues for his professional handling of the situation. The incident became a case study in military training programs about maintaining composure under pressure and dealing with difficult civilians. He never gave public interviews about the incident, following military protocol, but his commanding officers noted his exemplary conduct in their reports. The way he had maintained his dignity and professionalism while being harassed became an example for other guards facing similar situations. The castle implemented additional signage and briefing procedures for tour groups, making sure visitors understood the role and importance of the Queen's Guard before encountering them. Security protocols were also updated to ensure that similar situations could be handled even more efficiently in the future. Karen Mitchell had planned a luxury vacation that would give her bragging rights and social media content to make her friends envious. Instead, she became an international symbol of entitled tourist behavior and learned the hardest possible lesson about respect, consequences, and the permanent nature of digital shame. Her story serves as a cautionary tale for travelers about the importance of understanding and respecting the cultures they visit, and a reminder that in the age of smartphones and social media, poor behavior can have consequences that extend far beyond the immediate moment. Karen's 5 minutes of viral fame cost her years of reputation damage and personal growth that she's still working to repair. The lesson she learned, that respect is earned through behavior, not bought with money, came at a price she never could have imagined when she first approached that guard post with her phone and her sense of entitlement. It was a lesson she would never forget, and one that would fundamentally change how she approached interactions with others for the rest of her life.